Cynthia Hawkins, an artist whose exhibition we're within. And I guess I'll do a little bit of a few introductions. I'll say a few words about where we are. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you to Julia Trotta, who invited us both to be here. Julia is the curator of this exhibition of Cynthia's work, and she couldn't be here today because she's in Europe, but she's with us in spirit, maybe even virtually. As well as thank you to Christopher and Stars for welcoming us and for hosting this stunning exhibition in Los Angeles. So for those of you who need a little bit of a primer or an introduction to Cynthia's work, Cynthia is a painter and a printmaker who, as Thelma Golden put it in a 1996 essay, is concerned with meaning, value, and power. I like that. Cynthia is also a university gallery director and curator, most recently at SUNY Geneseo, but also a scholar and a writer, so a true multi-hyphenate. She has, in fact, a BA from CUNY City College, an MFA from MICA in Maryland, an MA in Museum Studies from Seton Hall University, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Buffalo, SUNY. Just wanted to give you that sort of sense, because I think those are the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Cynthia as an artist and this exhibition, as well as Cynthia as a curator and also a scholar and a writer. I should also say that your resume brings up a lot of really important spaces and events in your life, including you were an artist in residence at the Studio Museum between 1987 and 88. And Cynthia has shown in a great number of solo and group exhibitions, including solo shows at Just Above Midtown in 1981, a solo show at Cinque Gallery in 1989, and is involved, or her work is written about in numerous anthologies, including Gumbo Yaya, an anthology of contemporary African-American women artists, edited by Leslie King Hammond and Bell Hooks in 1996. And this is just a kind of partial, read of her incredible CV and resume. So this show is called Natural Things, and it's from 1996 to 99, this body of work that you made in that bracket of time. And I guess I wanted to start by talking about your work, specifically these pieces, since we're situated in it and everyone can see them. Do you want to say a little bit about how this work emerges, from, as you say, natural things, or your interest in the natural world or in science or in forms?
Sure. First, let me say thank you to Christopher and Julia as well, and to everyone from Wes and Missy, to my good friend Carter, for hanging in there with me all this time, and certainly my family. The thing about natural things is that it's one section of a long sort of an evolving, interest in not just what abstraction is and what it could be, but how to get there. So there was a point when I was very, sort of an abstract expressionist, where we're thinking about things like Hans Hofmann and pushing and pulling of color, and some kinds of organic geometric shapes. But at some point there was, for myself, a point where I wanted the work to be grounded in something, on something, and then to extrapolate from there. So, I guess I was living in, what is this? Yeah, so I guess I was living in Pennsylvania then, and certainly I remember making that painting over there, and doing those crosshatches, but there's a lot of trees around, lots of insects, wild turkeys that I met, which was extraordinary. If you ever heard wild turkeys and they're packed, you're like, what? What's that? And then, and all the deer. But, you know, walking and these, you know, sites of deep, heavy nature are full of surprising things. And so I began to look at the ground, the pebbles, the rocks. I began to, you know, just notice and notice where the sunlight was at the end of the day as it set. And so all of these things, you know, became part of my toolkit. And it's extraordinary how some of these shapes here from then are still apparent now. And they behave, I think, differently. They have a different orientation to, say, the world and outside, off-world. So, yeah, so, and these are oil paintings, whereas my newer work is acrylic because of a story. But, and I used a lot of oil stick in these days, as you can tell from some of the mark making. I think it's really clear, and which lends a really, so you can feel like you're using a pencil instead of paint, you know, where you can.
They're very gestural.
Yeah. So, yeah, so, you know, so then you just, before these, so these four are natural things. And then there's natural things too, which is the small ones. But before natural things was natural forms, which were bigger, and they were still talking about using the same kinds of shapes that went from the paper to these larger canvases, and they had a black background. But the shapes on them were not so different, but I think it was the color that in the end I did, like, I don't know, 5 of those, and then I stopped them because the shapes or the color of the shapes in the field reminded me of organs. So I had to cut that off. I did.
So your process is really, you find forms in nature and then you abstract them.
Yeah.
And they become your vocabulary for a range of compositions. And then the work between color and composition ends up being the kind of exercise of a series. And I guess, you know, I read many quotes of your and writing that you've done about your own practice. And it often comes up, this idea that in your artist statement, you have, my practice is abstraction. I make abstract work. You know, I have a continued commitment to abstraction as an act of resistance. So I feel like we should talk about abstraction and your belief in the politics of abstraction for you. And then maybe as a starting point to talk about abstraction, what you were just saying about series. This is natural forms. No, this is natural things. Before that, there was natural forms. But actually, all of your series end up having these titles that then the works are numbered within, which I feel like is a really interesting way to approach abstraction, because then you kind of ground it in a thing, kind of like natural things. So do you want to talk a little bit about abstraction at this point, or how you sort of stake your claim in abstraction?
Well, I am committed to it. And so I really feel like when I'm using all these natural things, that my job is then to reinvent them, reinterpret them, to make them something else. And and how do you do that? Is by inventing color, inventing relationships, inventing composition, putting it in a new realm. you know, some other realm. So, which is, you know, that's how I, you know, take this stuff and make it something else. That's my job, to take what I come across, what I see, what I use, and turn it into something else.
And then some examples of other series. So, you know, there's a kind of very direct relationship between natural things you find in the world and then this series, but others would be a series titled First to Arrive, or a series titled The Currency of Meaning. Do you want to say a little bit about those series or those titles?
Sure, so here, this is, all right, Currency of Meaning came before this. This is like right after my residency at the Studio Museum. Then I started to investigate sort of ancient forms, uses for circles, squares, and triangles by the ancients, and what these geometric shapes and how they were interpreted then and how they were used. And then with that, there is, you know, numbers 1 through 9. Then there's the letter, our letter writing system. And and then there's how the ancients used arrows, you know, how they used X's or cross marks and all the implications of meaning for all of these signs, we call them, right? So what happens with that work was that the sort of abstract expressionist work that I had done previously is now married to this quest for meaning through forms that we recognize, right? So, but as it goes along, then we have numbers that are upside down and then backwards, letters upside down, backwards, and reverse. So this, and the way they happen is sort of on the canvas is sort of really like a gesture and not planned. We like to say, I'm gonna do such and such. I do, and as I do, things change in and out, up and down. And then, you know, things like, you know, short marks in repetition, right, have a whole different, you know, they imply movement, just like the arrows. And so it's just all, we're marrying, you know, this implication of language and movement with a sort of expressionistic, in a expressionistic field.
Mm-hmm. And it also feels like it's related to music. I've read you reference jazz in relationship to improvisation in some of your writing, which I think you wrote about how it relates to jazz as a call and response, both in movement and in color within your process of making it. Actually, on my way over here, I was listening to Fred Moten and Legacy Russell talk about Jack Whitten's work and Notes from the Woodshed, which I feel like has a lot of kinship with your process here. The idea that the woodshed, you know, is this rehearsal space that's away from the public eye and that people can really, that a musician can really experiment in and have a certain amount of opacity and not have to break codes, feels very related to what you're describing in terms of making your own language and not needing to break codes.
The thing is, you know, because I revisited this, I know lots of artists who point to jazz as an impetus for their work. And so, but there's also people who say that they have a conversation with their work, right? So, and in that act of having a conversation, it is also that same call and response, right? So I'm just, at one point recently, just putting that together, that this is not, I don't think saying that signifies me to some, special place because it's about relationships, right?
Mhm.
It's about building a relationship with your paint and your materials and your environment and how to interact
Mhm.
with all of that to make something.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of a conversation with your peers also. I mean, within the work, but also with other artists working in a similar way, because there was a moment in your practice where you were already an exhibiting artist, where you decided to become also a curator and a scholar, and you started writing about other artists' work, and you started fleshing out the record of a lot of artists that weren't being written about. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that to kind of also flesh out your approach to abstraction and the ways in which you've written about abstraction, especially recently. I feel like more and more, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is this discussion about abstraction as activists is fairly recent, as absolutely, and I think it sort of also started to happen when I thought about and was writing about Charles Ethan Porter, who is still life and floral painter from, he lived 1847 to 1923. And he was African American, and so I started to have questions about his work and community, his work and race, his work and being accepted as an artist and not a representation for, even though he felt very strongly about his community, but it's like, why didn't he do, what everyone else did and use portraiture, paintings about, political and social leaders for his bread and butter, which a lot of people did while they did their other thing. So in some ways he obscures his race by being painting flowers and still lifes, right? So this is possibly, I have no proof, but he possibly made a choice, especially after being at the National Academy of Design as a student, that this was a vehicle through which he could actually sustain himself, right? And do what he wanted. So in that way, he's a floral painter, he paints flowers, but can we also see his work as activists, as an act of resistance? Like Norman Lewis wanted to be freed from the body so he could create content that, would be more meaningful to him, that he wasn't always talking about social structures, So, and then you gotta turn the mirror, right? You gotta turn the mirror around and say, hey, is that what I'm doing? But
Is it?
it has to, if it's true for him, maybe it's true for me.
Yeah.
But I never wanted to paint
Anything else?
anything else.
Yeah.
I made my last figurative painting in 1972.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have a
And
real commitment to
because I
abstraction.
knew when I looked at it, all I was really talking about was
Mhm.
direction, verticals, horizontals, and diagonals, and movement on the page. And
Yeah.
that was it. And I knew it and it was clear.
So you've written a couple of things recently that circle around your ideas of abstraction as activism. And I mean, the work that you've done over the many decades that you've been writing has been phenomenal in terms of really excavating a lot of names and putting them together and making resources of Black abstract painters in America, specifically in New York, right? With a focus on New York, mostly.
Yeah.
But recently you've been writing about, I guess, a question that's been ongoing for a long time about whether abstraction is a kind of extroverted political act or an introverted political act? So that is it about an act of resistance towards figuration, which on one hand itself was an act of resistance towards representation, right? When Black artists historically were painting Black figures, they're also resisting the external and other representations of Black bodies. But then also taking permission to not do figuration is an act of resistance and activism. But then also the very internal kind of work of using abstraction to present a personhood that wasn't available to Black artists, the sort of interiority that's not available to be presented when you're only looking at figuration. I know I'm saying a lot of things, but that's the stuff, the sort of not contradictions, but the paradoxes that exist in a lot of the writing about abstraction that you've done in others, and a lot of people you reference as well, right?
Yeah. It's really, it is a paradox, but I mean, like, what's your first goal, your first mandate, your first mission to be an artist, right? To do what you want to do. You know, my friend Joe Overstreet used to say he became an artist so he could get up at noon. You know, to do what you want to do first. So, you know, if you're considering just first what you require to move forward, you know, then that's what you do first. And then sometimes you think afterwards, well, should I do this or that? When Spiral started, that group was made up of abstract artists and figurative artists. And so the deal was, do we have to use representation to participate as artists in the struggle? Which is probably why the group only lasted 2 years, right? Because some people became very forthright about that and demanded a representation so that it could be read by the people and understood, right? But some of us want something else, you know, so I can, my performance as an abstract artist is one that is for the wider community, right? The wider world, to say that, you know, I am an individual and I demand equal access to whatever possible content there is out there that I want to participate in and not do what others want me to do. Right?
There's a sentence in your most recent piece of writing about abstraction that says, you know, essentially about what we're talking about. This concept has profound implications on the long-held assumptions about the relationship between Black interior life and Black collective political interests. And I wonder, in your own practice, the way that you've described compartmentalizing your work, maybe that's how the painting ends up being a space for your interiority, while the scholarship ends up being this place for the kind of collective politics.
Yeah, it's so interesting how one evolves, you know, and that you sort of like at one point recognize how your past, you know, has left you without leadership when you were, say, younger, right? Because my whole point to my scholarship is the recovery, right? It's an act of recovery for all these 19th century and early 20th century artists of color who are like waiting. I feel like they're waiting in the wings to be brought to public in any way we can. So when I was in college, I didn't know about Palmer Hayden. I didn't know about lots of people who are still alive and up in Harlem painting away. And I mean, I only became aware of Romy Bearden because I suddenly made a new friend who was one of his good friends, you know. And so she took me to meet him. She took me to meet Norman Lewis, you know. And so I was, you know, like, well, where were these people? I didn't learn about them in art history class. But that always stayed with me, and I always felt bad sorry that I didn't have a deeper relationship or understanding of what was actually going on among Black artists, right, in the early 70s. And so when I got to graduate school and I was, writing these seminar papers, and this slowly occurred to me. It wasn't like I'm going there to do that, but it slowly, it became apparent that the two parts, the history and the art and race and identity sort of coalesce into this act of recovery. So, and I do sort of really do keep them separate.
But it's funny, from the vantage point of now, they look so connected, or like they're different avenues of the same exercise. And then you became a curator. And so you were also putting that scholarship into practice. And I've seen you sort of talk about being a curator, how important it is to be an artist curator as a curator, or coming from the perspective of being an artist, which also reminds me that so many of those spaces, like Spiral as a collective, or various other groups that you talk about in your research, were artist-led and artist-run, and that the alternatives were being created by Black artists for other Black artists.
Right.
I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about your curating?
Well, sure. I started curating when I was teaching at this community college, and they didn't have a gallery at all. It was in the library, and they had these freestanding boards, and I took it to mind to ask the librarian, hey, can I install some artwork here? And so I talked some people into it, and so I started doing it that way. And so, but it was, very kind of open. I wasn't set on just one kind of work. And, but it evolved. And then when I was teaching at New Paltz, I taught a graduate drawing class and an undergraduate watercolor. And then for the graduate class, I try as an artist, instead of just giving graduate students, let's draw the figure, or let's do, still life or whatever, I wanted them to use their own work to figure out what drawing could be for them beyond that. And so we had some very interesting things, and I organized or curated a show for them at the end of the semester. It was really good. I mean, somebody who was a potter, ceramicist, burnt some apples in the kiln. Somebody came in with a bag of apples. I think it was me. And this one young woman, she took a bunch and she fired them in the kiln. They came out like glass. Wow. They had layers. They burnt into layers. It was just extraordinary. Right. So yeah, so I use my teaching to create exhibitions, even for toddlers. I just did a show of drawings by 2- and 3-year-olds, because I knew the woman who ran the daycare at
Honestly, the exhibitions sound a little bit like artworks as well. You know what I mean? They seem like experiments in space where you can kind of articulate your ideas or create scenarios that people can experience.
Yeah.
An alternative.
I also wanted, when I was at Geneseo, though, I wanted really to be very interdisciplinary. I wanted whatever exhibitions on occasion, there would be the contemporary show, or, say a historical show of 19th century, landscape painting, but then there would be programming around 19th century social history as well, right? So these paintings came out of this time, what was happening in literature and science, education or whatever. So to really show how art is part of everyday life and how art comes out of one's own time.
When we spoke in anticipation for this talk, I was telling you there's this exhibition that's up right now at the Hammer Museum here in LA called Without Your Interpretation by the video artist and performance artist Ulysses Jenkins from Los Angeles. And then also about this exhibition by Charles Gaines in the 80s, The Theater of Refusal, in which African-American artists were presented alongside the criticism that had been written about them and that had misrepresented them, and that were often using language like margins and the marginalized. And he was trying with that exhibition to kind of recenter. I think those two ideas are interesting in relationship to what you're describing, because it's also about the language or the social context that surrounds the work. I don't know, what was your experience at the time also about writing around your work, or about the way in which you were writing about other people's work?
Well, I think that I tried to, when I was writing about other people, I tried to, connect them to their time, what was happening around them, around the work, and to make the work not seem, esoteric, to have, so it would have more meaning, right? So, and when writing about myself, my own work, it was a real evolution, from the artist's, statement, the 3-sentence one, and then you get the 2-page one, and then you go back to the 1-paragraph one. It's like, nobody wants to read all this. I don't want to read it, but it's like, you got to work it out, like what you're thinking and what you're doing. But yeah, you start like there and you have 2 pages and then you're back at a paragraph, and that's that short, concise statement is supposed to hold, be able to impact people when they read it, and it so often doesn't, and sometimes doesn't have actually anything to do with, what it is you really think. But, it's like one of those things you just keep doing till it makes sense to you, I guess.
It's interesting that you use the word esoteric, because I feel like it's true that abstraction often eludes language, and that's kind of part of it, right? You're making a new vocabulary, so it's kind of hard to put into language. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in your writing around abstraction and your research, you talk about Hilma af Klint as one of the early abstract painters. And then also in the essay by Thelma Golden, there's an introduction where you introduce God as part of the practice of making these. So I wonder about spirituality in the largest sense, I guess, and how that fits into making of this kind of work, or your work, coming back to your work,
So the thing is like that article that Thelma wrote was about a particular body of work. And it was called The Creed of Athanasius and the Temple Curtain. And then I was really, being very religious at the time, reading the Bible and everything, which doesn't mean I'm not, religious now. I just don't act on it the same way. But how that work really sort of became manifest is because I met a bishop when I was in grad school in Baltimore. I didn't actually meet, he came to our church because they go around, and it must have been a special occasion because he had this red, coat, and the bishop's hat, and it was red, and I was like, wow. I was floored by this. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. And I used that shape of his headdress for paintings. And so that triangular shape, which is a soft triangle, I would call organic. But, and I used it over and over for like a couple of years, but, it ceased to belong to him, and, but it was, sort of, but it led to these diptychs with this soft triangle, pretty large scale. I think it was 68 by 50 each canvas, and there would be one with this triangle and one with the circle. So the circle, of course, is like unity, continuity, all of those things that, are very, religious in, a way, with the Trinity. And so the triangle also, speaks to the Trinity, but the colors were, very different in each one. They didn't look like they were a diptych, right? Because if you see my website, there's one of those paintings on there, and it has a red background with the triangle, and its partner is just gray with a sepia circle that goes through, touches all sides. So, but the last piece of that, painting-wise, was these gigantic white paintings of the Creed of Athanasius. Big circle with what I now call invisible marks, because they're very close. And but then after that, there was Meditations, which is a series of works on paper that are oil on paper in little triptychs, 3. Then there's Out of Water, by Water, which is also on paper, and it's like a triptych. But
you have such good titles.
Yeah.
You have such great titles. I guess spirituality is something I brought up because I think that there's such a connection, and Julia notes it also in your interview, with the otherworldly. Like there's an interest that you have in like these physics and also the physics outside, or that you can imagine. And it kind of reminds me of the process of science fiction writers like Octavia Butler, who kind of root themselves in hard fact and sort of like create a map of this real world in order, like these natural forms, to then create something fantastical and sort of outside of these physics. It seems like a kind of process, almost like that you use.
Yeah, it is like that. I mean, that's what it means to be grounded, right? To have a place where you can where you can hold onto something that, provides structure, and makes the work solid. It's not ephemeral, it's real, but it's also invented, so.
Yeah, I think you can see that in some of the works that also use mathematical symbols and, geometry in certain ways that defies its usage in this world. I think that might be all the time that we have for a conversation between us, but we can open it up for questions.
Sure.
Do you feel like we addressed a lot of things that we need to address? Would you guys like to ask some questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned early on how you noticed in a painting there was an image that looked like an organ, and so you stopped that. Right?
Yeah.
And you talked about how, I forget, 79 or 73 that you stopped making figures. Was it because the organ referenced the figure, or is it that it referenced interiority, or what was it about an organ that you wanted to eliminate?
Well, it looked like a internal body part. Okay, I curated a show not that long ago before I left Geneseo, and it was a group show. And one of the artists, she gave me a couple of paintings, and what I couldn't believe was, which people do all the time, is like when somebody has an issue they know, or it's them, some health issue, they start making paintings about diseased organs or whatever. And But yeah, so in those paintings, this shape, it had this particular color and like this sort of pinkish color. And I thought, God, it looks like a lung, and I was like, so I had to stop because I didn't want, because I can't see it. You know what I mean? It's, whether somebody else saw it or not is, I can't see it. You know what I mean? So, I mean, like recently I made a shape to put on in this painting, and I made it way bigger than I intended to. And I painted it all white. And then I realized it looked like, to me, a headdress and a head and a neck. And I was like, so I mean, I completely was like, oh no. Yeah.
You're saying it was too figurative. You're saying it became too
if I see it, then
representational.
it has to go.
Too literal.
Yeah, yeah. And like from where? It's just a happened,
Right.
an accident.
Yeah, I was curious from just in terms of the production of the works. There seems to be a bit of a pull between, I don't know whether you were taping them or whether you were leaving some parts of the canvas unpainted and then coming back in or painting over them. But I was wondering if you could speak to that kind of pull between under and over and how that relates to the forms. Used.
So sometimes, like this, in this one in particular, this grid you see there does not, occur under the rest of the blue. And when I started painting, I just like I have maybe a word like the word, a portal, I'm thinking like of an entryway or an exit way or sentinels or, and then I just throw paint at it. I draw on it, I just throw paint at it to get it started. And it changes a lot. I think that these early ones changed much less. There's not that real buildup of layers like I do sort of now, because I guess because they're kind of small, and you just, so that some of them seem like they're like drawings that have been colored, you know what I mean? Like, and not built up from the bottom, if you know what I mean? And, but like this one, the grid was put in there after and then scrubbed out in parts. And then, and it's not like I know that I'm gonna do that, I can put the grid in there, but then what happens after that? So then I do this thing where, if I have a shape and something cuts across it, sometimes I go, oh, this is a different field than this, the left side and the right side, these are different places, different fields. So the color can change or something could happen to it that's different than the other side. So, I mean, I feel like I just
Play.
It's like it just moves along, and it's that conversation, that push and pull. It's that, like sometimes I have forms I put in there and it talks to the other one. I put in this thing and I want it to talk to some other thing in there.
More
I
questions?
wanted to ask something that, and you've already touched upon it a little bit, given that these are from the 90s, right, as opposed to work you're doing currently. Like, just out of curiosity in terms of initial drawing, like, I mean, I look at these and I love the push and pull. I love the way the colors, juxtapose shape and line. and perhaps have conversations. But I'm just curious myself, like how much of this maybe started out with some lines?
Yeah,
that
yeah,
give you guidance
yeah.
or not?
Totally. No, I think, I would say that almost everything starts with, but it's also that what I always have to remember is that whatever I put down there, nothing's permanent, So the line work, the shapes I put in or whatever, I'm not, they don't have to stay.
Okay, yeah. So, and today, when you do work currently, is there a different way that you're approaching application of, you said layers of paint, you're working in acrylics?
Well, I would say that it's the same. This seems to be I'm allowing myself more leeway to just let things evolve,
They're a lot bigger now, right? Are you working a lot bigger?
Yeah. I mean, to me, these are pretty small.
Right.
And there's only a couple other things that's small, and they're these little green paintings from 87 or something. And, but other than that, the smallest thing I do and have done since is just paper, stuff on paper.
Is there a reason why you're working really large now?
I love large. I always did.
It's a relationship also to your body, or
Yeah,
is
I
it the
just
way you
like,
move around
it's
it?
so big. It's like, yeah, let's do it.
It makes sense. There's such worlds within each painting, so it's like you can be really enveloped in it when it's
Oh,
really
yeah.
big. Yeah.
We have a question from our streaming audience.
Oh, great.
Lisa McDonald asks, if abstraction is a form of resistance for the artist, why cues do you communicate with the viewer beyond the title that doesn't matter? I'm also gonna say, maybe Lisa, if you want to retype that, if you want to ask your question out loud, if you can hear me right now, Lisa.
No, what I meant was not why cues, but what cues do you give the viewer so that they
Lisa,
can
we
get a
can't hear
sense of
you
what you're trying to communicate?
here.
Can you hear me, or am I not
I
making
got
sense? Okay.
it. Okay, Lisa, we should hear you now.
Yes, I can. If one of the things that you had said was abstraction was a form of resistance for the artist at one point for you. And I'm just wondering that what cues, because a lot of times when I look at abstract work, your titles are very descriptive, and I want to know how you get, does it matter what the viewer sees or what they get from it? Or do you want them to just make up their, see whatever they see in it?
Okay, so that's a totally great question because it's the kind of question that most people have. I totally want you to see whatever it is you see. And the only reason there are titles, because I never used to give titles to anything. And I never even signed the front of my painting because I felt it was defacing it. And I didn't give titles because I didn't want to give you clues. But then when people wanted to talk about them, I never knew what they were talking about. I couldn't just, they would have to know what it looked like, what was, the content and all, in order for me to know. So I started to title things. And some of them are pretty, maybe descriptive. Some refer to what was going on at the time. So, but you should totally use your own, experience to, to create understanding for yourself.
What are you working on now?
Question from Christopher.
So now, currently, I'm working on a group of paintings called Gwen For's Soup, or The Proximity of Matter. And you're gonna say, what? Gwenfor is someone I know in Wales who's related somehow to my husband. He sent me a photograph on Facebook, or to everybody. And it was this orange image with these little tiny, like sort of rectangular things in it. But it was the color that totally like smacked me in the face. I was like, oh my God, that is so fantastic. And I emailed Gwenfor, what is that? I'm gonna make some paintings about it. He said, what are you talking about? It's a bowl of soup. Right? I was like, what? But I can't leave it alone. It didn't look, there was no bowl. It was just like this, like, image. And so that's what I'm doing. But, and then I had found this drawing and moving my studio around and bringing stuff over of a little drawing or painting on paper. And it had I even signed it, and it had a title at the bottom, The Proximity of Matter. And it's, in a way, it's very similar to Gwenfor's photograph. So I mashed them together. But the beauty of it, the way I work is that none of that matters, right? Because I have begun this, it doesn't have to look like soup, doesn't have to be orange, doesn't have to be any of those things. It will be something else.
So kind of in dialogue with the last question, the titles seem like wayfinding, but they're actually turning you the wrong way, or they're pointing in all different directions.
Yeah, the title, well, not really. I mean, I have some old paintings, like one. I was looking at it, and all of a sudden I noticed it had a title at the bottom, like really small. A Menagerie of Players. It's from 1975. And I remember that because my partner at the time was in summer stock. And so we were hanging out on Long Island, and I was like painting, and all these actors. I mean, if you know actors, I was Menagerie of Players, and that's why I got that name. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. I found another one. The slide said it was titled Air Smart. I don't even know what that means, but so some titles are sort of provide me the impetus to make the work, to do a new group of paintings, but they don't have to have any visual relationship whatsoever.
Well, they're always great combinations of words.
Yeah.
Clearly a writer. Oh, yeah.
You said that there was a story behind your switch from oil to acrylic. Are you willing to share that?
Oh, it's simple. Yeah, I had started this series of paintings called Clusters, which were based on my research about astronomy, stellar clusters, and black holes, and all of that stuff. And so I had already started. The first one was an oil painting. And then I got a call to have a show like in 2 months. So I was like, no way is this ever these things are never gonna dry. So that's when I switched to acrylic, which was really, and you all know, it's a real challenge to go from oil paint, which is so ably, manipulated, and to acrylic that's sort of like wants to be flat, So it was a little bit of a adjustment, but I have to say I'm still using it, and I think that my brushwork in the last 6 or 8 months has evolved again in using the acrylic, which is interesting.
Did you have a question?
Thank you for talking about the titling, because I feel like I always think about titling as something for the viewer. It was really interesting to hear you kind of turn that around. how it has a kind of specificity for you, even if it doesn't specifically take you to a certain place. You started by talking about this painting, how you remember making it, and it seemed to imply you didn't remember some of the other, the making of some of the other works. In the
Yeah,
same way, and I guess I also wanted to ask, in terms of specificity, you mentioned feeling like at some point you decided to start signing your works on the front, and that's part of the art within the composition. And that previously, I think you said you thought that that was defacing the composition, right? So I'm curious how that also, how you thought about that decision to.
well, you know, people are terrible when they buy your work. Then they want you to sign it. You know, I had this guy years ago bought a Currency of Meaning. This is a big painting. It's like 76 by 56. And he would, basically, he was like, wasn't gonna let me leave his apartment till I signed it. I was like, what? But I don't do that. No, so I do it so I don't have arguments. And I'm really bad at signing my work because if you look, if you pay attention, they're not very, they don't all look the same at all. I mean, because I have a hard time with the brush upright signing it, and
They're all forgeries.
I do. I remember this piece, and I remembered it very well because I did it in my kitchen in Pennsylvania. But I remember because the ink on there, the cross hatching, there's over 2,000 of those, and I counted them all as I was doing it. I kept track because it was just why I wanted to do that. I can't even tell you, but it was just like, it's like, and I am surprised that the ink held up as so well. I wouldn't have thought.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing all your ideas. and work with us. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Wow, thank you.
I hope I did a good job.
Oh,